The theme for this more scattershot or list form thing today is going to be diversity. That one of the weirdnesses of being a spokesperson for a community is that people do tend to assume that whatever you're saying is like the voice of the community. And so I wanted to take a whole big chunk of today to make it very clear that I am in no sense the voice of any gay Christian or gay Catholic or gay celibate Catholic or gay celibate Catholic from Washington community. We are not called to a life of seeking our own happiness or certainly our own self-perceived pleasure. And we're also not called to a life of self-protection. But all of us, all the people I'm about to describe as I give you portraits of people trying to live their walk with Christ, recognize themselves as called to a life of self-sacrificing love. This is and I tried to really hammer this home yesterday, this is the area on which our churches have most fallen short in ministry to gay and same-sex attracted people, is asking them to focus on self-preservation or self-protection or being safe and staying within the boundaries of what is easy and acceptable for the church to understand, instead of asking how can you pour your life out in self-sacrificing love. So, kinds of diversity. I'm going to start with, so let me say, a lot of yesterday, you maybe noticed that I do tend to think in terms of what does my church say, in terms of church membership, and also in terms of historical models. And you'll see this too. I'm going to try to talk about some role models for different ways of life and different spiritualities. And that's a way of thinking that I think can come across as somewhat kind of, I guess it's really obvious that I am more comfortable speaking from within the Catholic perspective than kind of like reaching out to others. So I sort of wanted to flag and highlight that at the beginning and to say two forms of diversity that exist within the Christian churches and within gay Christian communities are the scandal of church division, of division in the body of Christ, and then also whether we focus more on critical thinking or more on acceptance and obedience. So let me do the first one first. I did a presentation at a Dutch Reformed college in the States, and afterwards this girl asked me this incredibly poignant question, which was, a lot of your examples are about medieval knights and things like that. Do you know of any resources for people who are same-sex attracted who are Protestant? Is there kind of precedent for my life within the Protestant churches? And there's a couple different ways to answer this. One is the sort of blunt thing of like all Christian history belongs to all Christians. Whether you are Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, we can look at one another's churches and see what are the ways that people have loved Christ. I draw a lot of sustenance from looking at things like the Beguinages, which I mentioned yesterday, which are communities of lay women, which would cross church boundaries, church lines after the Reformation, and would bring together Protestant and Catholic women. So part of it is, if you find something in Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant churches that you don't belong to, that is life-giving for you and that you think may be a model for your walk with Christ, at least ask yourself, like, can that belong to me? Can I take that? I am a huge fan of stealing spiritualities from other churches. So part of it is just to say that all of that history does belong to you too. But the other thing is, yes, actually, there are specifically Protestant models. They can be harder to find, but for example, there's a recent biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in which the biographer Charles Marsh draws out the intensity and importance of Bonhoeffer's closest friendship, and the way in which that friendship proved life-shaping for him and proved a real source of sustenance in his Christian faith, even as he was being persecuted and imprisoned by the Nazi government. So that's the one that most immediately leaps to mind of someone who is sort of obviously like an iconic figure for many Protestants, who actually has lived through much of this intense longing for same-sex intimacy, which he's pretty open about, and managed to have a complicated but genuine and life-sustaining friendship that lasted at least through his imprisonment, I believe, until his death. And then the third thing to say is that I don't want to kind of prettify things. If you do not find a model in your church for a life outside of marriage, for a vocation that is celibate, I'm going to go ahead and say that that's not scriptural, and that might actually cause you to do some questioning as to where you should be in your walk with God. That because I do believe that church membership is a huge part of how we should think through all questions, if you do find that there is no room in your church for someone who lives as Jesus did, someone who is not married and whose closest relationships are with other disciples in the church and with friends, that's not a good sign of the church's fidelity to Scripture. And you'll see, and I'll try to throw in, again, you will find I am super handicapped in presenting non-Catholic models because I know them less well, but I will try to throw them in throughout this. And then I guess the other sort of almost an epistemological question of how do we answer questions in the first place is the question of critical thinking versus acceptance. We're taught, especially people who do a lot of academic training, you guys, have been taught a great deal about the skill of critical thinking. And it's natural for us to approach all questions in that spirit, and I would say, like, good to have that available to us as a stance toward our churches. But we are not taught the skill or the art of acceptance, of knowing when and what to accept, where to say yes in our lives. And you end up finding, at a certain point, that there will be questions that you are not intellectually equipped to handle, or you don't have the time, or you don't know where to turn. And some of these will be the questions most important to you and most pressing for your life. You may have noticed that I have done virtually no theological defense of my church's position on sexuality. All of my stuff is about how do you live it out. Virtually none of it is about why does the church do this? And a big part of that is that I don't understand it very well. For me, all of my project of finding ways to live as a gay Catholic has come about because has come about because I have accepted the church's teaching without having much of a grasp as to why it teaches that. And so figuring out when it is okay to place that level of trust in a church is huge, right? And what kind of trust that is. It is not a blind trust, and it is not a trust that protects the church from criticism. There are ways to do both stances, both critical thinking and acceptance and obedience, arrogantly. I think many of us have seen at some point a sort of arrogant critical thinking person who assumes that the church is always wrong and that they know better, or who assumes that they can sit down as a 20 to 30-year-old and solve problems that have not been solved in the past 2,000 plus years of Christian theology. I think that's unlikely, although you never know. But there's also an arrogance of obedience where you become defensive of the church and believe that it needs your protection against other people's intellects. And I've fallen into this in the past because I think my natural tendency is more toward obedience and sort of sure, fine, I'll do it if I have to. And that stance too can become prideful. So I guess I would just say, be aware of which thing you tend more toward, and maybe ask, what is the way to live out that calling humbly? How do I do humble critical thinking in the church? How do I do humble acceptance and obedience that is about my love of Christ and not about my judgment of other people's questions? You're gonna hear, I've mentioned her already a bunch, Melinda Salmas, who is sort of like a foil for me because she's such a different person. She is a Canadian Catholic author who is a lesbian married to a man, has a ton of kids. She is a really good example, I think, of someone who does critical thinking within the church and who is fearless in raising the toughest questions. She's writing a book right now on natural family planning, which I strongly suspect will be the only honest book on NFB ever written. She is not afraid of going for the places where her own life experience and her intellect have led her to most question what she's being told by the hierarchy and the people around her. But at the same time, she is actually an obedient Catholic. As much as any of us are. And she, I think, is a really good example if you want models of what it looks like to try to, the phrase that Catholics toss around a lot is think with the church. She's a good example of, like, how can you actually do the thinking part? And that's something that I have often regretted stuff that I've said to her, that I have thought, wait a second, actually, you were trying to get her to stop asking questions. You were trying to get her to, like, settle down and salute the flag and sort of, why don't you just try doing the things and suffering because everybody has to? And the thing is that she was. I think that actually is part of how you do critical thinking with humility, is willingness to suffer and to live with ambiguity, even as you are continuing to ask, why is obedience bringing me pain? So that's like, I wanted to kind of flag that because so much of how I understand these issues is through the lens of obedience and church membership. And I wanted to say, like, if you're hearing a little sit down and shut up, I actually don't believe that. And that it is fine to continue asking and to continue seeking. I believe there are ways to do that within obedience that are actually good for the church and bringing light and honesty and advancing sort of our understanding of what God wants from us. So, other forms of diversity. One that comes up a ton in the States, and I sort of hope this isn't relevant to you guys, but I'm going to throw it out there in case it is the question of identity and labeling. This is a super big deal in the US for reasons that baffle me. People are pretty divided, Christians are pretty divided on whether you should use the terminology of gay, same-sex attracted, or if you should just not use any labels at all. I'm going to throw out a framework for this, which is the two things you should be seeking in any really identity discussion, any identity of group any discussion of group membership, is honesty and solidarity. Of those two, I think honesty is probably primary. So there are people for whom it is. They've been told as they become Christians or as they come out and try to talk with their pastor and try to figure out what's going on, that they need to not identify as gay, and that is setting up an idol or a false community that's in competition with the church. That often has led people to be almost unwittingly to themselves, I think, even dishonest about the persistence of their desires, about the goods that they may see in gay communities, and to kind of turn away from that and to be within their churches isolated, having very little language to discuss what they're going through, and having limited, what's the word I'm looking for, social ties to non-Christians with whom they might actually share something in common. That, to me, I've seen that do a lot of harm, imposing a barrier between the individual person who's experiencing same-sex attraction and gay communities out in the world. On the other hand, there are people who have said, look, I really needed some time away from gay communities in the world because they are worldly. And I needed some time to really root myself in my church and my faith. And rejecting a gay identity label was really helpful for me for a long time. A woman who doesn't use her name online, but who did a blog called Disputed Mutability for many years, and I think would still stand by what she wrote there, I'm trying to think, I believe she would now say that she's gay and married to a man, like Melinda. She was in the ex-gay world for a long time and had a lot of criticism of that world, a lot. But at the same time would also say, there was a way in which I really needed to put my gay or lesbian identity behind me when I came into the church. I needed time away from that. And that allowed her to be honest about her own needs, about the anger that she felt toward the church, and that she kind of needed time to enculturate before she could even begin grappling with that anger. And it also allowed her to have solidarity with the people around her who had brought her to Jesus. So I think that like, if or someone you know, if they're in a position where they're trying to figure out, does it really matter if I identify as gay? Those are the questions you should be asking. What is the most honest way to describe where you're at? And what is the way that most binds you to other communities that you can serve? For me, that's one of the reasons that I say gay all the time, because that is a community that has given so much to me, and that I feel really obligated to give back to, and therefore I am tied to by membership. For a lot of people, using no label is the most accurate way to convey what's important to them and it allows them to focus more purely on their own vocation in life, on a more individual call. So again, I sort of hope this isn't a big deal in Canada the way it is back home. But I figured I'd throw it out there in case you do find people who either are really concerned about this themselves or are concerned about the language that you're using. If you say gay or if you say same-sex attracted, people will sometimes make assumptions about what that means. And it can be helpful to know going in that you can use whatever language is comfortable for you, but I would suggest being open to a pretty wide range of identity labels that people will, and that therefore to kind of confuse people who expect you to be coming from a certain stance or set of assumptions. The more different terms you throw out there, the less likely it is that people will assume that they know what you think already, which can be helpful in being welcoming and being someone that people can come to with their questions. Let's see. Vocations, the wide diversity of paths in which God calls people to love and serve him. I touched on this a bunch yesterday. I wanted to just list today. One that I didn't talk about at all yesterday was mixed orientation marriage. This is one of those things that everybody knows happens and nobody knows how to talk about. In part because I will say the ex-gay movement did a real good job of making everybody super suspicious and believe that mixed orientation marriage is an idol that people set up in order to get people to lie about the fact that they're still totally gay. I don't think it needs to be that. I know several people. Melinda, I've obviously mentioned, this woman disputed mutability, who is Presbyterian. Kyle Keating? Yes, Kyle Keating, who I forget what church he's in. He's a Protestant of some kind, who blogs at a site called Spiritual Friendship, where if you're interested in any of these vocational issues, that's a really good resource. There's a lot of different essays and perspectives at spiritualfriendship.org. And Kyle Keating is one of the main people there who blogs about his experiences in a mixed orientation marriage. One thing that everybody I know who's doing mixed orientation marriage about as well as anybody does any marriage, one thing they all have in common is that they were upfront with their spouse about being gay before they started dating. They have different levels of to what extent they thought their orientation had changed at the time of marriage, but most of them were pretty sure that it had not changed that much. And that I think actually is a pretty good assumption to make, even if it turns out later to not be true. It is better to go in my opinion, assuming that the things that are difficult at the beginning of your marriage will not get easier. And so they're, I think, pretty candid about the ways in which you can simultaneously love and be sexually attracted to your spouse, and yet still have a sort of overall personality and sexuality that is oriented toward the same sex. And sort of what that looks like, the ways in which that's difficult for the spouse, which, by the way, it's really striking to me how different the stereotypes are based on which sex is the gay one. That on the one hand, the wives of gay men, of people who say, I love my wife, I'm attracted to my wife, this is clearly the woman God is calling me to be married to. No matter how honest the husband is, the wife gets a ton of judgment of how could you possibly believe that this guy is really not stepping out on you, or how could you be so stupid? Whereas if you're a dude and you marry a gay woman, you are the guy who bagged a lesbian. It's extraordinary how different this is, and suggests to me that maybe we should all realize that sexuality is much weirder than we're used to thinking of it, and that people's lives take very weird twists and turns. And so I would say that's sort of my biggest comment on mixed orientation marriage, is that when people go into it with the attitude of life is weird, sex is weird, God is especially weird, that's a pretty healthy attitude to go into, where you no longer care that much what other people think. But I want to make sure to say that that is a possibility, because you know, well, because it is, because it's real, because some of you all may end up called to a mixed orientation marriage, and because you may meet people who are in that position if you're taking someone's, for example, personal history. You may find that, and it's good to be like, oh, okay, like this is a part of the wild human diversity that we all have to cope with somehow. Monastic life. I do know people who are gay or same-sex attracted, who are in religious orders. They generally, I think, seem like pretty chill people for whom it has not been, it's interesting, I have very little to say about it, right? Because it turns out to be not that important to them. I do think that if you have an unusually strong, if you perceive in yourself an unusually strong need for same-sex love and intimacy, you can find that in the monastery, and it will be super hard. Imagine being married, like inescapably bound to like 20 people. This is like brutal. But at the same time, in part because of that, it is, as with marriage, a path of sanctification, a path where precisely the inescapability of your brothers or your sisters and how grueling that can be is what moves you forward on your path. It's interesting. As much as I do believe and try to talk about the honor that we need to recover for celibacy, and the importance of giving yourself, and that we always think of celibacy and virginity historically, like these images have been used to say that people, including in scripture, people are devoted solely to God alone and undistracted. Their attention and their person, their being, their way of being every day is given to God alone in a way that someone who has family responsibilities often finds they simply don't have time for. In a sense, that's probably true. It's also true that if you're in the monastery, you are in an intense social situation where the stresses and obligations of community life actually can often make that wholehearted self-gift very complicated and difficult. If you ask monastics, what's the hardest part of your life? In the same way that if you ask people who have taken vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience, which one is the hard one, even people who really don't like the celibacy vow will always say obedience. In a somewhat similar way, if you ask people what's the hardest part of monastic life, lots of them will say prayer, which is the thing that they came to the monastery for. So that, I think, is in a certain way a comment on vocation in general, that the things that you go into your vocation wanting most to do are often the things it is hardest to find space and time for in the rack of everyday life. I feel like a lot of the work-family balance stuff that you guys have been hearing about here is about how are you able to not let administrative work or all the other things that can crowd in on the work of being in your family and the work of being a doctor. How do you keep all of the other stuff in its place? So you don't escape that in the monastery, is what I'm saying. Celibate partnership. This is an interesting vocation that people understand in a bunch of different ways. I have a few friends who are in celibate partnerships. All of those people are in same-sex partnerships that are two people. They are all LGBT identified in one way or another. Many of them, although not all, view it as a kind of merging of elements of marriage and elements of monastic life. In the same way that the medieval forms of friendship that I was talking about often did draw metaphors from both marriage and sibling relationships. So they would combine these kind of like obviously incompatible vocations to try to explain what they're doing. So for example, a couple of friends of mine think of themselves as having essentially a monastery where the core group is two people. and they've made a life together. They care for one another. They've done caregiving for one another in illness and disability, and have done their best to merge their finances, et cetera. Other people basically see it as somewhere in between a normal gay couple and a friendship, and they'll sort of go back and forth between that language as it seems appropriate to them. That seems to me somewhat less traditional, but friendship is highly traditional, so who am I to judge? But it's an interesting, I feel like, kind of tightrope of trying to live in a world where it is very hard to stay rooted. And a lot of the pressures against devoted friendships, and intentional community life, and against having your church as your family come from the need to be mobile, to follow the economy and to follow jobs. You can take your spouse with you, you take your children with you, but it's hard to end up in a position where you're taking your friends with you. And you just can't take your church community with you. If you want your church to be your family, you have to stay there. And so one way that people have tried to navigate this need to live a celibate vocation while still having someone that they can take with them has been celibate partnership. And one kind of practical implication of this for the churches is that you may have people who come to church in pairs, same-sex pairs, one of whom may be like, they may even sort of look like a gay couple in the sense of like one chick has real short hair and wears men's clothes, one chick has more fluffy hair. You may even sort of be like, okay, and you actually genuinely do not know where these people are in their lives and what their vocation is. Having that reality available to us as a possibility, I think, can turn down some of the heat, especially in smaller churches that are sort of prone to gossip. And just being aware that our call in the churches is to give guidance to one another and to learn from one another. And that many of the people who may seem to be in irregular situations are actually either not or are moving toward situations of more and more conformity of their lives to Christ. So there's a great little podcast by Frederica Matthews Green, she's the wife of an Orthodox priest, talking about what happens if a same-sex couple starts coming to my church. And she's basically like, isn't that your pastor's job? Don't you have like a person whose job is to shepherd souls? Maybe let him do it. Which is, in some sense, like we are actually all called to watch out for each other, but also a good reminder of kind of how little we know about the lives of the people who come to our church, especially as we're just first getting to incorporate them into the community. Oh, and I wanted to give, because I have a historical example for this, and it's so fascinating to have found one. Celibate partnership is, I think, probably the newest of these vocations that I'm listing. But there's a mid-20th century example of an English poet, Dunstan Thompson, or he actually is American now that I think of it, American poet living in England, Dunstan Thompson, who was in a pretty ordinary, somewhat emotionally tortured gay relationship. He found the love. No, that's right. Let me get this timeline correct. In his youth, had some pretty difficult, emotionally and spiritually grueling gay relationships. He went through a lot of you read his poetry and it's like, oh, you are suffering. But at the same time, he's not a Christian. He was seeking the love of his life, which he then found, a man named Philip Trower, who's an English journalist. They settle down together. His poetry gets a lot calmer. They become kind of a happy domestic mid-century gay couple. And both of them convert then to, Thompson definitely became Catholic. I think Trower did as well. But both of them convert to Christianity. And because of that, stop sleeping together. And bless their hearts, Dunstan Thomas has the guts, or whatever, to write to his bishop and say, here's my situation. Is it okay if we continue to be a household and to live together? I would not do this, I have to say. I would just do it. If the bishop has a problem with it, he can come to me. But apparently, Dunstan Thomas wanted to do this the right way, And the UK bishops, who actually are pretty interestingly forward-thinking and creative on the subject of same-sex attraction throughout the 20th century. His bishop says, go ahead. It sounds like this is all fine. There's nothing wrong with making a life with your best friend. And if you look him up, you'll find some of his later poems. One in particular, a very short poem, is a really touching tribute to his partner, with whom he lived for the rest of his life. Let's see, what's the next one? Friendship, right, which I've been talking about this whole time. You can find models of friendship as a life-shaping reality, again, going back to the Old Testament, as a life-shaping call from God. And up until the present. If you're interested in what does devoted friendship look like, especially in the context of same-sex attraction, but also more generally, Wesley Hill is the guy you should be reading. He has a couple short books. One is called Watched and Waiting, Reflections on, I think it's Homosexuality and Christian Faithfulness, something like that. This is his first book. He wrote it when he was a young man and kind of like, again, somewhat like Dunstan Thompson, although with a very different personal history, sort of a tortured soul. So just know going in that it is a book about the loneliness of youth, and especially the loneliness of not knowing what your future will look like. But it is, in my opinion, one of the best portrayals of what that feels like, one of the most spiritually rich portrayals of what that feels like. His most recent book, Spiritual Friendship, Finding Love in the Church as a Celibate Gay Christian, you can kind of hear that something has changed, and that he's now looking more toward exploring what does it look like to try to sustain lifelong friendships in a mobile culture. And he hasn't found the answer. He's very clear at the end that he is still not sure, even though he is in a friendship that has been blessed by an Anglican priest. He's Anglican. He's still not really sure where this is all going. And that in itself is valuable in showing, even no matter how much historical background you have, no matter how dedicated you are to this, no matter how much you perceive in yourself an intense hunger for friendship, it is still economically and culturally really hard to sustain. And I think that message of the unfinishedness and the ambiguity at the end of Spiritual Friendship is a really poignant reminder of how much each of us in our own friendships could sacrifice more and could give more, and how much the churches are unaware of how many love, what's the word I'm looking for? Love partnerships of friendship are broken up by economic pressures and by the lack of a cultural language to say, what if we should be making our lives together? Service, pouring oneself out in service to those in most need as a life-shaping vocation. A really poignant example of someone in the gay world is Father Henry Nouwen, Catholic priest who, like Wesley Hill, perceived in himself a deep hunger for especially same-sex friendship. And went through, like Wes, like a lot of people, right, sort of a very tortured early period of his life where that unmet need for love kind of made him rigid and grasping. And he writes very candidly about the degree to which he had to sort of die to self in order to break out of that shell of need. He ends up working at L'Arche, a community for people with mental disabilities. And again, at the time, he sort of just thinks of it as the work that he's doing, and slowly but surely this begins to be his life. And he begins to see the deep friendships that he is forming with people who are not always able to have the kinds of conversations that he might have envisioned, or who aren't going to have the kind of life in the world that he would have expected for his friends, but who are nonetheless, like, for whom his love and their love for him is palpable, that he has found the thing that he is seeking for in a place that he had initially come to solely to serve. And one thing I will say before I leave L'Arche, one thing about L'Arche that was really striking to me is that they created rituals to mark entrance and exit from the community. They had big birthday celebrations and also big celebrations to welcome people into the community. It seems to me that one of the things that is most missing from many of these non-marital and non-monastic vocations is a lack of ritual and a lack of kind of beauty, a lack of adornment. that makes it harder to know what you're doing. With friendship, it can be genuinely difficult to know how much obligation you've taken on. And I think part of the reason that Wes wanted to have this friendship blessed that he talks about in Spiritual Friendship is precisely to have both some beauty and some clarity added to what can be a fairly ambiguous relationship today. Is that all of it? Service to your family. The extended family is the other big Old Testament model of same-sex love in Ruth and Naomi. Whither thou goest, I will go. Your people will be my... Why am I switching from thee to you? Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people and your God will be my God. That's an extended family relationship. And it is one that very obviously is marked in the text as teaching us what it means to love God. Okay. Other forms of diversity, your level of certainty, your constancy and settledness in your vocation and in your church and in your faith. You guys probably here now represent a very wide range of relationships to Christ and levels of kind of settledness in that. And every point on that spectrum is there are gifts that you can give to others from where you are. I, for whatever reason, mostly I think just my personality and being like an extremely impulsive person who doesn't think much about things before I do them, even at the worst and lowest and most sort of despairing points of my drinking, did not doubt the reality of God or that he loved me or that his death on the cross was our redemption, that his broken body and his blood pour out forgiveness and salvation for all. I was like turning away from that, but I did not doubt that it's reality. And that's one point on the spectrum where you can, and similarly, I have never wondered if I should stop being Catholic, or if I should like stop relating to the church from a stance of obedience and submission. These are just like, these are not things that I can enter into from lived experience. I just am where I'm at. There are ways where you can give to people if that's where you are in your own church membership and your own walk with Christ. There are that solidity, I guess, or sort of like motionlessness can actually be, they're really helpful to people who are struggling. But it can also be really alienating, obviously. And so if you're at a very different place, I have lots of gay Christian friends who have been at all different points on the spectrum, you know, where they thought that they were totally committed and they were totally going to do the submission to the will of God, and then it gets really awful, and they start really doubting that this is what God is calling them to, or that there is a God, or that they are in the right church. You know, they go through a ton, and people who are at every point on that spectrum can serve one another and guide one another to a deeper and humbler faith. I've seen with a couple of friends of mine, sort of amazing, beautiful, kind of heartbreaking conversations in which the person who was, in which they were able to really relate to one another and shepherd one another and be gentle to one another because neither one of them was quite as settled in their own church membership and their own relationship to God. So that's sort of, there's nothing really else to say about that except that even at times in your life when you are in a more tumultuous relationship with God, you can seek out other people who have been through that, who are at a very slightly closer point to being at peace. Those are the people who will probably help you the most. And similarly, if you are at a point where there's someone who's a little more tumultuous than you are, but not that much, that may be the person you are most equipped to serve. In a way that someone who is more kind of like, why can't you just do the things, is not going to be helpful. People are in very different positions in terms of their economic needs and the economic consequences of following church teaching on same-sex attraction. Specifically, especially in terms of legal protections, I've had friends who have had to consider and have ended up making various decisions on the question of whether they should get a civil same-sex marriage in order to protect their friend or their partner from things like medical bankruptcy or other really severe economic consequences when they themselves, they knew that they were living chastely, but there is no economic structure for that, for a same-sex partnership that is not a marriage. So that's I feel like, again, as you guys are meeting people in wildly diverse situations, it's relatively unlikely that you'll meet someone in that particular pressing situation. But I do think it brings home just how little in our society, including in our churches and Christian institutions, is set up to provide practical, material support for vocations other than marriage. Let's see, do I really need anything else? One quick point, what you most long for, there's a huge diversity in terms of what people find most difficult about following Christ. This is true in anything, but with same-sex attraction specifically. Some people really long for the sex, that's a real thing. Some people really long for the companionship, someone to come home to. Some people really long for biological children. It's like again, I said this yesterday, it's like a mammalian thing. And my experience has been that which of these things you long for the most has virtually no relationship to what your ultimate vocation is going to be. Some of the people who most long for biological children turn out to actually be called, like perceiving a specific personal definite call to celibacy. Some people for whom like they really just wanted same-sex intimacy and really would have been pretty happy settling down with a same-sex friend, end up in mixed orientation marriages. It's like the one thing that they didn't really care about. So what I sort of take away from this is that God is fairly capricious, and that your own longings, there are times when your own longings will be a guide to where you're being called, but your ultimate vocation may have very little to do with what you understand to be your deepest longings. At least your deepest, I would say, secular longings. And then the final kind of set of diversity that I want to talk about is spiritual diversity, diversity of one's spiritual path. Even within the Catholic Church, there's this huge wide range, and people would be like, oh, are you more a Franciscan type, or are you more a Carmelite type? And I spent a really long time thinking that I just didn't have a spiritual type, because I would read Carmelites and be like, this is baffling to me. Why, I would say I have the thing that I have the most longing for, I think, is mystical union with God. The way that other people want children, and sort of marriage and sex and stuff. I think the thing that is most poignant to me that I almost always lack is that mystical prayer. And so but even there, I would read John of the Cross and be like, this is pretty much unintelligible to me. So for a long time, I thought I didn't really have a personal spirituality. And then I quit drinking and read a ton of 12-step stuff and was like, oh, you have this super embarrassing spirituality of being really AA-like. But that did kind of help me to see that the language that people respond to is so widely varied. And it ends up being about your image of God. There are some people who, because of their previous experiences, some images of God will be really painful for them. A really obvious one that especially a lot of gay people have, is God the Father. Viewing God the Father as a judging and kind of unloving person. I think I mentioned yesterday the friend of mine who realized after many years of faithful obedience as a same-sex attracted Christian, and he was like, look, I thought that I was pretty chill about this. And then I fell in love with a guy who was also Christian, but who believed that gay marriage was something that God was calling him to, and we talked a lot about that. And as we talked, he drew out of me how much my image of God had been warped by the anti-gay church that I grew up in, and how much I had come to view God as someone who did not love me and did not cherish me. He's still actually in, I think, a branch of that same church, but has radically shifted his view of God, I think, and is really working to kind of rediscover a relationship with God on a totally new basis. So people have different elements of different images of God that are the hardest for them, and different images of God that are the most natural draw. This is why we need, and Scripture provides such a huge range of images of who God is. God as friend, Jesus as the friend, Christ as liberator, the one who frees us from everything that keeps us in bondage, whether it's bondage of the will or political oppression. And God as higher power to whom we surrender our will and our lives. This is the one that made sense to me. I find the whole Christ the Liberator thing, like, I understand that it's important and real, and it doesn't speak to me on the same level as God as the recipient of our surrender, in the way that I think the hymn that we were singing today, you alone, to you alone may my spirit yield. I feel like I spent a lot of my life looking for somewhere to yield, and finding that you can't do that to other people. That's a form of idolatry, really bad for everyone involved. But I had this need to yield, and found in God as higher power, like a place where that was love. So I guess my only real point in terms of same-sex attraction on this is that a lot of where people are coming from on this issue is deeply shaped by their own image of God, and a lot of what resonates with them and helps them to live their vocation is finding the spirituality and the image of God that makes sense for them and is unique to them. All right, and I will say, before I stop, I will say that's the reason that one reason I talk so much about history is that when you do find the image or the form of spirituality that helps you, it is so powerful to realize that that someone can teach you a better way of kind of deepening your pre-existing spirituality. Okay, I'm gonna do questions. Let me start with the ones that you all gave me yesterday, so they get to jump in the queue. I have no idea how much time I just babbled for, so. Can you take an opportunity to share more about your personal testimony? I'm curious about how you came to terms with your same-sex attraction and Catholic faith personally, and how you expressed or communicated to your previous partners or friends. What was that process like? Let's see. So, again, like, this is one of those weird questions where people expect me to be more reflective than I actually am. I didn't really think about it. I will say, coming out to myself, before I was Christian, coming out as gay to myself was a huge relief, because I had had for a while, since childhood, some feeling of alienation, of being separated from those around me. And being able to give it the name of being gay was actually, like, really great, because I had been raised in a pretty progressive environment where that was not a bad thing. So I was like, oh, okay, there's nothing actually wrong with you, you're just gay. I later came to think that was an oversimplification, and that some of what that alienation was about was actually more a spiritual condition of sort of recognition of the alienation that we're all subject to after the fall. But at the time, coming out to myself was actually, like, pretty easy. This is a really weird and unusual, you will not meet that many gay Christians who will have that story. That, I think, really helped me as I was becoming Catholic, because I was not coming from a position of shame about my sexuality. I had pretty much a lot of self-confidence about that. And so the combination of that with the fact that all of my Christian friends seemed, if not equally personally comfortable with me being gay, certainly recognized that I was personally comfortable with it and didn't seem to think that was weird. And that was a really big deal, to have the assumption that gay people are not coming to you ashamed of themselves, but are kind of, it's sort of your job. Maybe you should be ashamed of your thing. And that you guys can kind of meet on the front of neither one of us, both of us are standing within something that we perceive to be good. So because of that, and they spent no time trying to convince me that my gay thing was bad. I think they perceived that, like, A, perceived that it wouldn't work, B, didn't care that much, C, recognized that they didn't know that much about, this is like 1996, 97. So even there was a lot more public acknowledgement of gay people, but still nothing like today, where you would have much more, I think, contact with stories of gay lives. So they did, I think, sort of hands off a little, which turns out to be exactly the right thing. So there wasn't ultimately a ton of outward reconciling that had to happen. They were all people, many of them were converts. Everybody was really upfront that becoming Christian is not just the same thing that you had before, only better, that it really is a transformation of your life, and that a lot of stuff that you thought you could keep will have to be either shed or transformed, but they did not guess which things those would be, which turned out to be really good. They did not say, well, the thing that you'll have to sacrifice is your gay identity. They just said, look, like, there are ethical rules. There's a Christian sexual ethic. You're either going to do it or you're not, but you need to know what it is. And even there, they did not, as I mentioned yesterday, they did not bring that up to me until I asked them about it. All of this, I think, made everything so much easier. So in a way, this is really much more the story of how the Christians I encountered reconciled their faith and my same-sex attraction. They kind of did all the work for me. So I had to do very little. I only had to say, can I accept this? If I need the Eucharist, can I live in the way of life that Jesus is proposing? Once you get to the point where that's the question you're asking, most of the work has been done. In terms of telling it to other people, talking to other people about it, I was super awful for a very long time. With same-sex attraction, specifically with my gay friends, I was a little better because, again, like, I kind of had the assumption that I was not in the wrong in the sense of what I was saying was untrue, but that I was in the more sketchy position, that I was proposing the thing that was weird and that they had no particular reason to take seriously. And that was actually fairly helpful in terms of keeping me from being a jerk to them. So specifically on gay stuff, I would only talk from within my own experience and only if I was asked, as far as I remember. With Christianity in general, though, I was a total big obnoxious jerk and really regret some of the ways in which I kind of like pressured friends of mine to confront questions that they didn't want to confront, that they were in ways that were disingenuous on my part, and to kind of bully them into, how to put, not even really into being Christian, but like into taking Christianity seriously in a way that was more about my plans for them than their own spirituality, their own hearts. So yeah, not a really great process. And the process there was that they got mad at me and I apologized. Let's see. So you mentioned this morning that the Catholic Church had no position or claim on the origin of homosexuality or same-sex attraction. Many people have developed their own understandings on causes, and if they've come to terms that this is not by choice. What do you think are some contributing factors to our society's broken sexuality? So I think these are a couple different questions. Every culture, I think, organizes human sexuality and understands human sexuality through a different set of terms. So you can ask questions like, was Socrates gay? And this is not really a question that makes a ton of sense, even though he's very upfront that he had sexual relationships with men. But the identity concept of his culture was based on such different factors. Like, who was the dominant partner was more important. Whereas today, like, lots of people just don't care. So in terms of like, where does same-sex attraction come from? I think the longing for making a life with someone of the same sex and the need for same-sex intimacy is a nearly universal human need, and some people in every society have had it much more strongly than others. For some people, throughout history, that's shaded into sexual attraction. I think to what extent we recognize our own sexual attractions and to what extent we make them important in understanding our longings is basically dependent on culture. And you can actually watch the degree to which same-sex desire was understood to be sexualized change over time. A letter that someone might write in 1720 to his male friend can use the exact same language as what someone would write to his husband today. And no one in 1720 would have batted an eye or thought that this was in any way representing sexual desire. And so that means that there's a lot of, it's kind of, to even say, what does it, how to put, what's the origin of same-sex attraction? In a certain sense, the origin of same-sex attraction is our longing for same-sex intimacy. And the fact that that's distributed differently in different sort of intensities throughout the population. Another way to put it is that like sexuality is really weird, and different people have different kind of quirks and different inclinations that shape their sexuality in various ways that we don't understand very well. In terms of why did Western culture become so suspicious of same-sex intimacy? Why did the presumption become that same-sex intimacy was homosexual? I think a big part of the story really is the decline of public friendship and the rise of marriage as the universal vocation. Once the life-shaping vocation is inherently a sexual vocation, you are attuned to see all of your longings for intimacy, for physical contact, for love as primarily erotic, well before Freud. Freud is only sort of crystallizing and making more crude what modern society, starting very early back, arguably starting with the Reformation, had been doing. So that's sort of a weird answer, right? Because it doesn't really tell you anything about any individual person, but I kind of did that on purpose. You alluded to situations where you would speak up always if it's obviously ethically wrong, like hitting your children. Are there really ethical decisions that are important regardless of membership in a church, versus versus the idea that my only central relationship is to Jesus by choice? 2, is a relationship to Jesus really a choice? Right. Oh, I don't really know. I don't know for the second one. To me, I did not feel like I sat down and chose to have the question presented to me of, are you willing to become Christian? Once that question was presented, I did perceive myself as choosing yes or no. Even there, it was based on recognition of what I believed to be true. And so choosing otherwise, choosing not to enter the church, would have been a violation of my conscience, which I know that for lots of people, that's just not how being Christian looks to them. They can be not Christian. Like I don't think that my sister stays up at night worrying that she's violating her conscience by not being a Christian. So I don't really know to what extent and in what ways Christianity is a choice for us. I have no good answer to this. Other people may do better. In terms of ethical decisions that are binding on non-Christians, my instinct, and this may be a very philosophically shaky answer, my instinct is to say that it's almost as much as you can get away with in society of the moral law and where you share premises. Why not propose to people that their own premises may be leading them to a better ethical conclusion? An easy sort of example of this would be what you guys are grappling with now with assisted suicide and euthanasia. There's a basic kind of humanist perspective from which all lives are of infinite value, even lives that are not valued by the person living them, even lives that are characterized by suffering or by terminal illness, that nonetheless life is infinitely precious and equally precious. That claim of equality, of a sort of inescapable equality, is something that makes sense now to a lot of non-Christians, perhaps because of what someone, Dan, yesterday described as middle grace, the sort of the rack of Christianity left on the beach as the tide recedes. But it's still there, right? Why not let people use it? The U.S. Declaration of Independence, right, says all men are created equal. I believe that word created actually is fairly crucial in terms of developing a robust philosophical understanding of why that's true, of why human equality is true. But if people aren't willing to go to the created place but still accept the human equality, why not? Why not let them do it? Instead of letting people say, well, maybe the suffering or the weak or the elderly or the unborn are not equal after all. So that's my instinct. I'm not sure if that probably doesn't cash out to every single political or moral question. But in general, I think lots of people now share unexplored or hidden or undefended premises that are gifts from Christian history, and that, like, let them.